Okay, great. So I am going to pass the floor to um, I will pass the floor to Iqra, Nat, and Helen.
Hi, everybody. Um, Thanks so much. I think so. My name is Nat Paul, and I am the Director of Education for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which means I'm also the Director of the sort of educational wing, which is called the Canadian Civil Liberties Education Trust. I want to begin first by thanking Debbie and Tanya and everybody else at OCASI for including us in today's event. We were extremely excited to learn about the Journeys to Active Citizenship program and extremely disappointed that we only learned about it at its very conclusion because we would have liked very much to have been to have sort of made this relationship and work together through some of the years that we're coming up into it. Um, but never too late. So it's very exciting for us to be here. I'm going to start I guess I'll share my screen first here. So I will also say, just a moment. I'm so bad at this. It's like I always forget how to share my screen as soon as it's time. So, um, do you guys see my PowerPoint coming up?
Yes, we
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Now I just have to move this bar so that I can actually get to the parts of it that I want to see. There we have it. So I also think that I should begin by saying that I'm sort of coming into this sort of space with working with newcomers as a sort of an absolute beginner, but one who's sort of very excited to be able to do this. And that is, of course, because the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and by extension the Education Trust are really, really sort of deeply invested in promoting the values that are consistent with democracy and holding governments and policymakers accountable to the sort of the best goals and the loftiest goals of that. Um, and part of how we do that is through public engagement. So the big part of what the education program does is not exactly what everybody thinks of when they think of the CCLA, when many people think of the advocacy work in the court cases. But a large part of it as well is going into the community in a bunch of sort of different kinds of community settings and talking to people about what their rights are and talking to people about what happens when rights are in conflict with one another. And as many people have noted so far, it's not an accident that we speak about, the context of newcomers to Canada in precarious times. We see importantly, as many governments, including our own, are moving towards sort of what we would call sort of rights limitations and rights restrictive kinds of governments, removing funding and programs and supports that can be used to clarify legal processes. Um, and so one of the things that we know is that when these legal processes are confusing and when these legal processes aren't clear, they become a lot more difficult for people to use, which raises the question of whether or not these sort of the institution that is the justice system is living up to its promise. And I think one of the things that so as we're invited to speak in a community of practice here, one of the things that I think is really positive about being able to work in this space is the ability to be honest about some of the shortcomings of the justice system. And so one of the things that we're hoping to talk about is some of the challenges and some of the frustrations that people who do work that has a sort of a legal context to it experience when we actually try to go and meet people and give them sort of the information that they need. Um, so I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about what my organization does, and then I'm going to leave it with Helen and Iqra from CLEO, Community Legal Education Ontario, to speak about some of the really, really excellent and exemplary work that they're doing. I'm going to begin with a sort of a foundational concept. That is, if I can get my screen to switch slides, there we go. So first, I'll say a little bit about the organization. So for those who don't know, CCLA, or the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, is Canada's national rights watchdog. We're a not-for-profit, we're not part of the government, and we're nonpartisan. And all of that is fundamentally important because we don't receive any money for any of the advocacy or work that we do. It's all done through donations. And most of what we're well known for doing is actually suing the government. So we are the organization that takes governments to court when they make laws or take actions which violate the rights which are provided, particularly the rights that are provided under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We're nonpartisan, which means that we stick up for rights irrespective of the perspectives or the specific claims of the people who are making them. The idea is to stick up for rights as a matter of rule of law and as a sort of a fundamental baseline that we can use to hold governments accountable for the things that they do. So again, we distinguish then between the advocacy work. So people will recently have heard many of the things we're doing, things involving trans rights in schools, things involving privacy initiatives, things involving bail reform in the criminal justice system, and things particularly nowadays involving religious freedom and freedom of expression throughout Canada. So you can see a couple of my colleagues on the top there. So that's the advocacy side of things. On the education side of things, we do different kinds of work. So we go primarily into classrooms and work in law and civics classes at the secondary level, but also in primary and graduate and teacher education. And we're working with people on how to do rights education and how we can use talking about rights to introduce sort of critical and difficult conversations. So here we see some of the numbers that we've done. We do sort of about 8,500 people a year, and increasingly we're focusing on newcomers. So right now we can see that about 10% of the work that we did in 2024 was in fact with newcomer audiences. I want to give again this foundational kind of concept here. And that is one that it's sort of frustrating that it doesn't have much traction outside of the justice education or public legal education sort of community. And that concept is legal capability. I had the pleasure of working a lot on legal capability when I was with a different organization, the Ontario Justice Education Network. And it's a really useful concept. So whereas most people probably haven't heard of legal capability, many people will have heard of financial literacy. And this is kind of like the same concept, but applied to the justice system. It's the idea that, most people at some point are going to encounter the justice system, and that most people's encounters with the justice system are going to be much, much more successful if they understand a little bit more about how it works and what their rights are and how some of those processes go. So the idea behind legal capability is the idea of the extent to which a person is able to manage legal issues, or the extent to which they're comfortable accessing the justice system for whatever purposes they might need. And in some cases, that can be things that are, very urgent and very immediate, like in the case of, immigration consultants who haven't been completely above board, or it could be in the context of not understanding what your rights are with respect to a landlord, and a landlord who wants to enter your rental unit without, giving proper notice. Or things like what the rules are in terms of when the landlord has to turn the heat on and at what temperature. And all of these things vary from community to community. It can also, though, have to do with less or some kind of change in your community at every level. And it's so important, I think, to be actively taking on this idea of a community of practice where we can sort of share these opportunities, because this is, of course, how these things get moving. Everybody who's working in this space, I think, is working from a fairly limited budget. And so it becomes really, really important to be able to collaborate and share resources. So this can mean things like community improvements, but can also mean things like organizing protest and organizing, opportunities to go and speak out about what's happening and making people feel comfortable with that. So everything from what do I need in order to, in order to get through the basic parts of my life, for everything to how do I actually start to engage with bigger projects and have an impact on my community, as is the design of democracy. All of this, I think, is about legal capability. So this is and these are all sort of also in our view forms of active citizenship that are legitimate no matter how small they are. They're parts that get us moving and parts that get us engaged and having those impacts. So we are looking to engage newcomers in order to grow civic participation. We want people to understand the opportunities that they have to have these impacts, and we want people to feel comfortable doing so. We think that this builds stronger communities and more accountable and more healthy democratic communities. So we want people to be able to know what their rights are and to take ownership of them so that they can play active roles in their communities. We've worked with in 2024. We've been quite successful working with 27 different organizations and delivering 44 workshops. So we've been most active in Ontario, but we also, as a national organization, are working in. We've worked in Nova Scotia and in Quebec and in Alberta as well. We've gotten very good feedback on this. For the most part, our discourse has been appropriate in terms of its level, but I also say we're learning as we go. So, we have in particular, one of my colleagues, Megumi Harker, has been working really, really hard to constantly be improving and getting feedback on the things that we're doing and making adjustments as we go. And we've had very good feedback all in all. So generally speaking, people have said that they were very engaged and that the content was very relevant, and uniformly that they would come back. And in particular, some of the feedback from the organizers and the partner agencies has been really, really welcoming. So the idea that people are constantly being told what they can't do, but here we have people telling them what they are able to do. And the idea that understanding that you're moving from one kind of rights environment into another one, which might be very different, is in itself useful for people as they try and orient themselves to their new communities. So in terms of the content, I'll do a little bit of a rundown of what we've done. And I will say as well that we're doing this and so happy to be able to speak to such a great range of agencies, because we really are, we're learning as we go, but we're hoping we can learn together. So if there's interest, we would love to work with you. We have the capacity to travel through around Ontario. We also have the capacity to do virtual workshops. And we're interested in reaching out, and we're interested in partnering with great organizations doing good work. So, a couple of things that we do. It's been my experience that most people, whether irrespective of how long you've been in Canada, have a poor understanding rights and freedoms, which govern relationships with government agencies and government decisions, but then also provincial human rights organizations. So in Ontario, this would be the Ontario Human Rights Code is the legislation that lays this out, and the different kinds of contexts in which either of these two sort of legislative environments apply. So we do a sort of a rundown of what fits under the Charter versus what fits under the Human Rights Code. And and we clarify as well that so the way that the way the charter works is that it's part of the Constitution, which makes it the highest law of the land, which means that other laws have to be consistent with the charter, which is how we get into the capacity. We need to go to court and assess whether or not a particular law or a particular action has violated the charter in a way which is unreasonable. So all rights are limited, and this is a contextual thing, and it helps to sort of speak about how it is that we strike a balance between rights and freedoms, but then also the inconvenience and the rights and freedoms of others, and how democracy ideally is supposed to manage this balance. We want to be really, really clear as well, and this is a thing which I think has been important, that the Charter is not something which applies only to Canadian citizens. With a couple of exceptions around things like mobility rights and entering and leaving Canada, and then voting rights as well, which are reserved for citizens. The Charter applies to everybody. And that is, functionally, that is because the rules of Canada apply to everybody in Canada, and so do then the protections against those rules. Um, So, in some of the ways that we've been the most successful about this, and some of the things that have been, I think, the most relatable and the most important, have been things like the fundamental freedoms which are provided under the Charter. So, this is your freedom of expression and your freedom of a peaceful assembly, freedom of religion, and freedom of association. So here we actually see, those freedoms which are probably most closely linked to being able to speak out and work for change. The idea that we can get together, the idea that we can express ourselves, the idea that we can associate and form, and form communities and form practice in order to work on common goals is very much fundamental within here. So we have had some challenges depending on audiences. So as you folks will know, the context of these things matter very, very much. So we have to convey information which is complex to people who may or may not have more or less experience working in English and French. And so we manage this with a number of sort of what are called nested educational strategies, which are there to sort of provide a diversity of kind of learning experiences for people. So adding visual information and context and guiding interactive practice. In terms of concrete things, we do a lot of work with laws that are like Bill 21, which many people will be familiar with right now, which of course is a bill in Quebec, a law in Quebec which limits the capacity of government employees to wear religious clothing. So we will talk about teachers who have been forced out of teaching because they had to choose between their work and their ability to wear a hijab, or many other government employees in Quebec who are being forced to make this choice, and whether or not that's a reasonable law. We've also gotten a lot of traction out of so one of the things that people are very interested in these sessions has been freedom of religion and expression. The other one that I think we get the most interest in is dealing with police. And so this is something that people are particularly interested in with respect to their kids, is something that we found. And so we also offer stuff which is sort of best practice in dealing with the police, but also sort of what your rights are when you're dealing with them. And we always try. So this one you'll see says Edmonton. This is because we try to localize everything so that everything that we talk about belongs within the context of the community in which we're speaking. So we can see here, we will do a rundown of what police officers are expected to do if they want to speak with you, but also so what your rights are when you're stopped. We'll go over what these are, and we do sort of particular scenarios, and we can deal with questions about what they are supposed to do and what rights you have, for example, and when you're detained as opposed to when you're just engaged with police, because these are also things that are very, very poorly understood. And of course, there are particular rights that kick into place when you are formally detained or arrested, as opposed to when you're just engaged with police. What is expected of you? Can you walk away? Again, the difference between detention and engagement, the difference between what happens if you're in a car or on a bicycle and engaging with the Highway Traffic Act, because that's different and not everybody fully understands that. And then, of course, considerations around, in fact, which populations are likely and more likely to be engaged in this way. I know that some of you will have seen that Desmond Cole is going to be speaking later on today. Mr. Cole's work in respect of documenting the incredible imbalance in racial profiling and engagement with police is exemplary and has been the basis of a lot of really, really important teaching. So I'm going to thank him in advance for the work that he's done there. But of course, this is work which you can't ignore the apprehension of racial bias that occurs with this, and the disproportionate way in which Black and Brown people are targeted for these kinds of police engagements. And there are really interesting questions that come of that. There are really interesting questions that come, and I think probably this is a way of starting to talk about some of the frustrations, because what our rights are in these contexts and what's a good idea sometimes are at odds with one another. And I can speak about that a little bit later, but I want to make sure I leave enough time for my colleagues here. So again, we look at concrete resources, and now I think that it's probably as I move towards passing the baton over here, I think one of the things that has been important is for us to sort of acknowledge that for most sort of adult audiences, as opposed to the younger audiences, when we have adults coming out to sessions, it's because they have sort of concrete things that they're concerned about. And whereas we've heard a lot of really positive feedback about sort of understanding what your charter rights are, um, most of the action happens when we start to talk about your rights in everyday law. So those more concrete things that I spoke about earlier. So landlord and tenant things, and employment things, and family law, and immigration law, and all of those things. And so more and more we've started to sort of again tailor these things to the specific communities that we're in. So this was from a session that I did with the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. So we looked at neighborhood legal services, which were sort of within the catchment for those folks. Um, and showing people, what some of the concrete places they can go are for, low cost legal help. And this is really the point in these sessions where all of a sudden people start taking out their cell phones and screenshotting. Oh, so that's what a student legal organization does. Oh, and there are specialty clinics. Oh, so there's Chinese and Southeast Asian clinic, and there is the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, and so forth. And then at some point, I get to Community Legal Education Ontario, and this is where it really takes off. And so a big part of the impetus of this was to say, well, then let's bring CLEO to the table here. Some of you will have worked with them as well. But they really are doing, in my view, just the best work with respect to this kind of stuff. So this is probably a good place for me to pass it off to Helen Anderson from CLEO. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Helen.
Great. Thank you very much, Nat. And thank you, Tanya, for inviting us to be here today. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. One moment, please. All right. Sorry, I'm going to make it into presentation mode. Just one moment. Great. Okay. So my name is Helen Anderson, and I'm the director of CLEO Connect at CLEO, Community Legal Education Ontario. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Iqra Rafique, who is a lawyer, curriculum developer, and trainer with CLEO. I'm joining you from Tkaronto, also known as Toronto, which is Treaty 13 territory between the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the British Crown. And Iqra and I are going to be speaking a bit about the role of public legal information in civic engagement and a bit more about access to justice. So in terms of access to justice, Julie Matthews and David Wiseman wrote a paper on community justice help, advancing community-based access to justice, and explored this idea of what is access to justice. And they determine that meaningful access to justice means that when a person faces legal issues, that they can pursue their goals, that they can address their law-related problems in ways that are consistent with fair legal standards and processes, and that they can obtain, understand, and act on information and services related to the law, and also where necessary, that they can achieve just outcomes. And so access to justice can be both an individual thing. So in terms of that, a person, when they're facing a legal issue, that they have access to justice, but also thinking about civic engagement. This can also be something on a more systemic level. So advocating on a larger level for access to justice for the broader community or for particular groups. And so I would like to ask you to take a moment to think about what might be some barriers to access to justice. So what might be some barriers to fair legal standards or accessing legal information and services or achieving just outcomes? So if you could take a moment to enter in the chat what you think may be some barriers to access to justice, that would be great. So what can make it difficult for people? Okay, language. Yeah, some not knowing that they have rights at all. Financial barriers, lack of rights, technicalities, immigration status. These are all great responses. Thank you very much. So I think these are all examples of barriers to access to justice, and some of the ones that we've noted can be complicated legal information and processes. So definitely people who are English language learners or French language learners and not totally proficient yet, it may be difficult to understand some of the legal information or processes that need to be followed. Sometimes there's a lack of access to information. For example, if it's all online and people have limited access to the internet, or if they have limited digital literacy skills, that can pose a barrier. The cost of hiring a lawyer, someone had mentioned financial barriers for sure. Power imbalances between people. So whether it's a landlord and a tenant, an employer and employee, these can also pose barriers. Systemic inequity and bias. And so Nat touched on this a bit earlier. So looking at bias within systems and within processes as well. And also lack of services, depending on where someone's located and whether they have free or low cost services, it may be difficult for them to access services. And so thinking about why access to free legal information and support is important in general, but then also for civic engagement, it's important that people are able to understand systems and processes so that they can make informed choices and so that they can exercise their rights. So being able to exercise one's rights and understand what one's rights are important to civic engagement. And civic engagement can also involve political action when someone may not be able to access their rights or when communities are denied rights. So I want to share a little bit of information about our organization. So Community Legal Education Ontario, or CLEO, we are a not-for-profit organization, and we are part of the larger community legal clinic system. And we are a specialty legal clinic that offers free, reliable, up-to-date, and plain language legal information and resources for the public. We've been in operation since 1974, and there are a few different areas of CLEO. So we specialize in easy to understand public legal education and information. And our goal is to empower people in Ontario to exercise their legal rights. We focus on people living on low incomes or who face other barriers. And we also support frontline community workers to help people facing legal issues. And the four main areas of our organization include Steps to Justice, which Iqra will share more about shortly, but this is a website that has answers to over 700 frequently asked questions about the law. We have free publications that you can order on many different areas of the law. We also have our guided pathways, which are online tools to help people fill out legal forms and documents. And then CLEO Connect, which is the area that supports community workers or other trusted helpers that assist people with law-related problems. So as I mentioned, this is a screenshot of our Steps to Justice website, and Iqra will share more details about it. Then we also have our publications, and you can order the publications for free online. So I have a screenshot here and an arrow indicating where you can order the publications. And so you'll see that we have brochures in areas such as debt and consumer law, employment and work, family law, health and disability, housing law, immigration and refugee law, income assistance, the legal system, plain language resources, wills and powers of attorney, and also posters and bookmarks. And some of these resources are available in multiple languages in addition to English and French. And this is a screenshot of our guided pathways tools and our CLEO Connect training. So we offer webinars monthly for community workers, both on areas of the law as well as on building skills to help your clients. And then we also offer free workshops for nonprofit organizations. So these are workshops for staff specifically on building legal help skills and navigating the Steps to Justice website. We're unfortunately not able to deliver workshops directly for clients or deliver workshops about the law, but we can connect you to organizations that can support with this. We also offer free courses and events throughout the year. So these include the two-part legal help skills and housing law course that Iqra runs. And we are also working on developing an upcoming online housing law course that will be free and self-directed. And we also have in-person events. So for example, we have an event coming up in March in Windsor on supporting refugee claimants. And so to learn about upcoming events, you can subscribe to the CLEO Connect newsletter. And as we talk about supporting community workers, we often get questions about what types of help people can provide. And I think anyone can feel comfortable referring someone to the Steps to Justice website where there's reliable legal information, or you can feel comfortable referring someone to a legal service. But in terms of providing specific legal information yourself, I think it's important to think about what your knowledge base is or what's in your wheelhouse. So we usually pose the questions, have you had some training on this issue or in this area of law? So is this an area of specialization for you, or are you less familiar with it? Also, is your knowledge up to date? There can be changes in legislation that may make older information out of date. So you want to make sure that if you're providing information about a specific area, that your knowledge is up to date. And also, do you give this help on a regular basis? So if you regularly assist someone with understanding the eviction process, for example, then that may be part of what's in your wheelhouse. But if it's a newer area for you, then it's always appropriate to refer someone to Steps to Justice or potentially to a legal service. And we also have tip sheets and referral information. So if you'd like more information about providing legal help for your clients or about making referrals, we have tip sheets on detecting legal problems, giving legal information, clues to reliable legal information, sources for online legal information, legal services in Ontario, helping clients with legal questions, hiring and working with a lawyer, as well as making referrals for legal services. And then we have the Your Legal Rights resource collection, which includes resources from nonprofit organizations across Ontario. And this is also a really great way to learn about organizations that are engaged in different areas of legal information and informing people about their rights, because if people want to themselves get engaged in a particular area, we have lots of different nonprofit organizations from Ontario listed in our Your Legal Rights resource collection, as well as free resources that people can download. In our monthly newsletter, we share legal information and news from across Ontario, upcoming events from CLEO or other organizations. But we also share campaigns that other organizations are engaged with. So if people are looking for ways to get involved in their communities, ways to advocate for their or other people's rights, then our newsletter is a good way to learn about what's happening across Ontario. And some of the organizations that we've been involved with, either as presenters for our webinars or that we featured in our newsletter, include the S4 Collective, which is Sanctuary Students Solidarity and Support Collective. So for students who are in Ontario who have precarious immigration status, TTC riders who educate people about their transit rights in Toronto, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, Justice for Workers, the National Right to Housing Network, or Healthcare for All Now. So these are all organizations that CLEO has engaged with and that present opportunities for people to learn about their rights and also to learn about ways to exercise and advocate for their rights. And so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Iqra now, who's going to share a bit more information about Steps to Justice.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. So as has been mentioned a few times now, my name is Iqra Rafique, and I'm one of the staff members at CLEO. So one of the things I get to do at CLEO is write for the Steps to Justice website. And the Steps to Justice website is a website that CLEO runs that gives step-by-step information on common legal questions. We have about 700 frequently asked questions on our website. And these are in many different areas of law. So that includes housing, employment, immigration, criminal, family law, powers of attorney and wills, income assistance. The questions are written in plain language English for an 8th grade reading level. So we have a team of editors that we work with to ensure that the content fits a plain language reading level. And the questions are meant to equip the reader with basic knowledge about a common legal issue, as well as information about possible steps they can take and services they can go to for further help. So as we have it included on the slide, the questions will link to forms, checklists, self-help guides, and further resources that the reader can turn to for further help and information. And on the website, we also have a live chat function, and it is run by a real person. It's not a bot. And what someone can do if they're having trouble finding the information they're looking for on the website, they can ask the live chat that question. People do ask for legal advice through live chat, which we unfortunately cannot give. And so Mary Ann gives a referral or she tries to answer the best that she can. Perhaps we can go to the next slide, Helen. So as Helen had shown before, this is our homepage. And there's different ways that someone can find information on the website. So at the very top, if they click on legal topics, a menu will appear of each of the areas of law that we have questions about. Another way that they can find information is by using our search feature. I prefer actually using the legal topics function just because I find our search bar, unfortunately, is not as great as almighty Google. So if you misspell something, it won't tell you like, hey, do you actually mean this? Is this what you actually mean? It won't do that, and it might just give you an erroneous result, or it won't pull up anything. I forgot to mention that our Steps to Justice website is also offered in French, and so you can see on this page here at the very top where it says Français. If you click on that, you get a French version of the website. So it's all of the same information. It's just written in French. Unfortunately, we don't have the website in languages other than English and French. We know that there's a need for that, but but that's just not something we're able to provide at the present moment. Yeah, Helen, if you could go to the next slide. So this is an example of our immigration law section. So there's quite a lot of information that's presented on this page. To the left, we have a list of all of the subtopics that we have relating to immigration law. So if someone's looking for information about a temporary immigration program, they can click on the temporary program subtopic, or if they're looking for information on how to sponsor their family member, they can click there. Or if they're looking to apply for permanent residence by way of a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application, they can click there. And then we also have information about if someone is detained, or if they know someone who's been detained on immigration grant for immigration reasons. And you can see the rest there. So it's very comprehensive, and our questions are written in a way so that so for every question, we have about 4 to 5 steps that a person goes through to find out the answer to the legal issue. To the right hand, you'll see that we have a find services tool. So, if after someone's read through the question and they think, okay, well, now I have a basic understanding of how to sponsor my family member, for example, but I need help in completing a sponsorship application, they can click on Find Services, and that will give them a list of relevant services they can contact. Now, it's important to know we don't advertise for-profit legal services. So we don't have a directory of lawyers, for example, that someone can reach out to. All of the services we advertise are nonprofit services. And we have our reasons for that, but we know that a large portion of our audience are people who likely won't be able to afford private services. And so we want to make sure that we highlight the services that will be the most accessible to folks, and that likely won't be biased. And then we also, to the right, have a link to a relevant guided pathway. So, Helen mentioned guided pathways earlier. There are form filling tools that CLEO has developed to help people fill out forms on their own if possible. They do require a certain level of sophistication. So a user does have to be proficient in using tech, laptop or a computer. They do have to be fluent in English or French. And they can take some time to fill out. So they're not something that someone can do in 5 minutes. They might take some time. And we often encourage people to complete them with a friend or a community member, someone that they trust to help them work through that tool. But it's a way for someone to kind of fill out some forms on their own rather than having to go to a legal professional or to another service. And then further down the page, we have a list of external tools and resources. So these are tools and resources that have been created by community organizations or the government that may be of relevance to the reader. And the Steps to Justice page, I should mention, this is how the page looks on a computer or a laptop. It looks a bit different on a cell phone, but all of the information is available regardless of how you view the site. Helen, I just want to quickly turn to you if there's anything that I may not have mentioned that you think might be relevant.
No, I just noticed that there were a couple of questions in the chat. One was about adding Google Translate to this. One of the issues, we've talked about that, but one of the issues is because we need to ensure the accuracy of the information, and we can't ensure the legal accuracy of translations in all the Google Translate languages. It does pose a bit of a barrier because we have a lawyer review all our French content for accuracy as well. And so we do translate some of this information into other languages in our publications, but unfortunately, having a widget like that for our Steps to Justice site isn't possible. I don't know if you want to add anything about that, Iqra.
No, I think that's great. And the other question is the live chat 24/7. It's not 24/7. I'm blanking on the hours right now. I think it runs from 11 a.m. to about 2 or 3 p.m. But if someone, when the live chat is offline, what happens is whatever someone enters, it gets emailed to an email address we have, and then Marianne, who covers live chat, she'll respond during the operating hours. So we really do try to respond to everyone, whether it's during the online hours or during the offline hours. And one other thing I forgot to mention is that we are frequently adding new questions and updating our questions. So we're very well aware that there are changes to the law and immigration law in particular. Just throughout the last year, there are so many changes pertaining to temporary foreign workers and international students in particular. And so we monitor for changes in the law, and we update our content accordingly. And we, as I mentioned, also add new questions. And we love getting feedback from the public about questions that they think or information that they think we should add to our website, because we really want to make sure that the content that we have is relevant to the broader public, in particular folks who may have who may have difficulty accessing legal services for a variety of reasons: cost, language barriers, intimidation by the legal system. So we have some information on our Substance Justice website. I believe it's at the bottom of the page, which unfortunately we don't have on this slide, about how you can provide us with feedback. Perhaps let's move to the next slide. So I thought it might be useful to just give some information about referring folks to legal services, because a reality is that, Nat and Helen touched upon that, someone might have that legal information and then they know that, okay, I have rights and I know that I have options, but they might need help in terms of applying their rights and information. And taking the next steps, whether that's filing an application at a tribunal or a court, or writing a demand letter, or whatever it is, whatever the exercise might be. And so things that we tell, some suggestions that we give community workers about, when you're referring someone to a legal service is, keep in mind the geographic region of where they live. So, if someone's living in a rural place, you wouldn't want to refer them to somewhere that's too far away from where they're living. You want to keep in mind if legal services only offer services to people living in a certain geographic region. So CLEO, for example, we write for an Ontario-wide audience, but there are some organizations that will only serve people who live in Toronto, for example, or Guelph, or whatever the area is. And then another thing that we suggest to people is to keep in mind any other eligibility criteria. So financial is a huge one. A lot of free legal services will only assist people who are low income. Low income can be defined differently by each organization. I found generally low income refers to the low income cutoff amount set by the federal government. And then some places might have demographic criteria. So there are clinics in Ontario that only assist certain communities. So for example, there's ethnic-based clinics. So they only serve certain ethno-specific populations, like the Chinese Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, the Black Legal Action Center, Aboriginal Legal Services. There's also clinics that only serve other populations. So there's the Advocacy Center for the Elderly, and they only serve senior adults. I believe it's like 60 and older. There's the HIV and AIDS Legal Clinic in Ontario. There's the Workers' Rights Clinic. So there are these clinics that have specific demographics of people that they assist. Another thing to keep in mind is what are the areas of law covered by the legal service? So I think something that lay people often assume is, well, if I call this law firm, they can help me with any area of law, but that's not the case. There's always a specialization that happens. And so with the legal clinics in particular, none of them provide family or criminal law or civil law services. And so those are important things to keep in mind when you're making a referral. And then some other things are, if there's any limits to the length of service. So for some free legal services in particular, phone lines. So, and I'll discuss them in the upcoming slides. You can only call maybe 2 or 3 times to get free legal advice on a particular issue. And then after that, you're cut off. And that's because of capacity. So these services aren't able to kind of keep helping that same person with that one issue because it means they're not able to help other people. And, we've mentioned a few times, cost is something you always want to think about when you're referring people to different legal services. And then finally, accessibility. So language is a huge one that's already been mentioned a few times as a reason why someone might not access justice or try to access it. And so you'd want to keep in mind, if before you're making a referral, well, will that place, is there anyone there that can speak the language that my client, that is their language, or will there be interpreters available, or can they bring a friend with them who can serve as the interpreter? Other things to keep in mind are, if you're making a referral for someone who has a disability, will the place have, like, for example, if they have a physical disability and they require the use of an assistive device, well, will the place have an elevator? Will they have a ramp? Will they be able to actually access the service in person? And then another one that I think sometimes people don't think about is trauma. And so, a lot of folks who, especially newcomers to Canada that are seeking refugee services in particular, they might be carrying a lot of trauma of whatever sort with them because of the persecution that they face back home and then now settling in a new country. And so you'd want to keep in mind as much as possible, is the place that I'm referring them to, will they be able to provide them services in a trauma-informed way, or will they further the trauma that they're experiencing? And so these are just some general tips that we like to give to community workers when we give our presentations. And as I mentioned before, I thought it might be useful to go through them now. How about we move to the next slide? Thank you. So I will very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on these different organizations, but I thought it might be useful to also just mention a few of the major organizations in Ontario that offer free or very low cost legal services. I know Nat already touched upon them, so thank you, Nat. So a big one is Legal Aid Ontario. So Legal Aid Ontario is funded by the Government of Ontario. It's an agency that provides free or very low cost legal services to members of the public. And they do it through a couple of programs. So one is their certificate program. So that is where someone can call Legal Aid Ontario or fill out an application online and get a document called a certificate for their legal matter. With that certificate, they can go to any private lawyer that accepts them. And the certificate essentially says to the private lawyer, don't charge the client your fees, charge Legal Aid Ontario instead. So Legal Aid Ontario will pay the fees. So this sounds great, but the reality is that Legal Aid Ontario only provides certificates for certain legal matters. So for some criminal matters, for some immigration and refugee matters, for some family law matters, and for some child protection and mental health matters. And a person has to be low income in order to qualify for Legal Aid Ontario. The other program that Legal Aid Ontario funds is the clinic program. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So Legal Aid Ontario funds a number of clinics across the province to provide free legal services to the public. I believe Ontario has the most well-funded and robust legal clinic system in Canada. I'm forgetting off the top of my head exactly how many clinics we have, and Nat and Paul, if you happen to know, like, feel free to jump in, but we have several. That's a high number.
Yeah, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I know I believe you're right. I believe it is the most well fleshed out.
Yeah. So and the main types of clinics that are funded are called community legal clinics. And so basically the province has been carved out into these catchment areas, and each catchment area is essentially a geographic region that has one or several, depending on the population size, legal clinic. And these clinics are places that anyone, so long as they live in the catchment area and so long as they are low income, can go to get free legal services. However, clinics don't provide services in every area of law. Generally, they provide services in income assistance, housing. Some clinics provide assistance in immigration. Some provide assistance in employment and human rights, and some primarily rural clinics, so clinics that are, more in the northern parts of the province, they might do a little bit of wills and powers of attorney assistance. And so in addition to the community clinics, there are the specialty clinics that I mentioned before. So these are clinics that will help specific communities or demographic populations. We have the one on this slide called the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario, and they help low-income tenants who have a hearing before the Landlord and Tenant Board. They provide them with advice the day of their hearing. They don't provide representation, they only provide advice. But other specialty clinics are all of the ethno-specific ones that I mentioned. So the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, the Chinese Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, Aboriginal Legal Services, Black Legal Action Center. And then you have ones that are even more, that aren't ethno-specific, but like the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario. There's the Advocacy Center for the Elderly, the HIV/AIDS Legal Clinic, and then various workers' clinics. And another type of clinic that Legal Aid Ontario funds are student legal service organizations. So there are several law schools within Ontario, and most of the law schools have a legal clinic on their campus. And at that clinic, it's law students under the supervision of a licensed lawyer that provides services to clients. It's a way for students to get their feet wet and help folks, and it's a way for folks to get free legal help. These clinics also only provide help in certain areas of law, and they tend to close down when students have exams. So the services are limited, but they are an option for clients. And an organization that's not funded by Legal Aid Ontario, but provides free legal services, is Pro Bono Ontario. So they run a legal advice hotline that anyone can call, and they provide free legal advice in consumer protection issues, in corporate law matters, in employment law issues, for folks who are going to court for a civil matter and they want to know about the court procedure and the court process, they can call them, in housing law issues and in powers of attorney. So they do have a limit to their service, as I mentioned earlier. A person can't keep calling them again and again and again to get advice or information on the same legal issue. They do put a limit, and I believe it's a person gets at least 2 phone calls, but I could be wrong. And then there's also the Law Society Referral Service. So the Law Society of Ontario is the professional regulatory body of every lawyer and paralegal practicing in Ontario. And they offer a program called their Referral Service Program, where anyone can go to the webpage and then connect to a lawyer in whatever area of law they need advice in and get a 30-minute phone consultation. And this service also has a limit. I believe someone may get at least just that 1 phone call on a particular legal issue, maybe 2 phone calls. And there's also the Ontario Legal Information Center. So they're a little bit similar to CLEO in that they only provide legal information and not legal advice. But a key difference is that you get a free 30-minute meeting with a lawyer, and you get free legal information. They do not give legal advice, and that meeting can be over the phone or it can be virtually. And finally, we have JusticeNet. So JusticeNet is an online directory of lawyers, paralegals, and mediators who offer discounted rates. So it's a great directory for folks who make too much money to qualify for any of the free legal services that I just went through, but they don't make enough money to comfortably afford paying for a private lawyer. So they can go to JusticeNet and they can find a lawyer who provide services in whatever issue they need help with at a discounted rate. And so I thought it would be important to kind of go over some of the realities of accessing justice. And Nat and Helen have both touched upon this. So we know that there's what the law says, and then there's reality. An unfortunate reality is that even when you give clients legal information or refer them to a legal service for advice and representation, they may still not get the resolution they want for their issue. And we can see this really clearly when it comes to issues related to housing. So I'm just going to throw out an example that demonstrates this. You may have a client tell you that their landlord isn't fixing a maintenance or repair issue in their home, and maybe the client has bed bugs or a broken faucet or the heat isn't working properly, and you know that they have rights enshrined in the law. So you give them legal information about their rights. Perhaps you go on the Steps to Justice website, you find a question that provides them exactly the kind of information they're looking for, and then you refer them to their local legal clinic or to their specialty clinic for further help. And then the client goes to their clinic, and a lawyer tells them that the lawyer could send their client a demand letter demanding that the landlord fix the issue. Otherwise, the client will file an application to the landlord and tenant board. But the client gets scared to send this letter to their landlord because they fear that if they do this, the landlord will try to evict them or make it harder for them to live in their unit. And the client is also scared to send this letter because the lawyer tells them that, if the landlord doesn't fix the issue and they do apply to the board, it could take months for them to get a hearing before the landlord and tenant board. And so the client doesn't want to jeopardize their current housing situation while they're waiting for a hearing. And they can't afford to move anywhere else because the cost of living keeps increasing. The price for everything keeps rising. And so they can't afford to pay more rent on top of paying more for groceries and gas and other expenses. So in this case, the client knows their legal options and they have access to free legal services, but because the client is scared to lose their home because of, factors that are bigger than them, a housing crisis and a increase in the cost of living, they're hesitant to access justice through the legal system. And instead, they decide it's cheaper and safer for them to fix the maintenance issue on their own and not involve their landlord, or even though it's the landlord's responsibility under the law to fix the issue. And when I used to give, when I was the lawyer in these situations and giving legal advice to clients, I would be honest with them from the start. I would acknowledge that, yes, you have these rights as a tenant under the law, and these are your options. You can go to the landlord and tenant board, you can write a demand letter, but the reality is that the landlord could retaliate against you. And then, of course, I would let them decide what to do. And so depending on your role and your professional obligations, you may be able to help the client come up with solutions for their problem that don't involve them engaging with the formal legal system. And that's not to say they shouldn't know that they have these rights and they shouldn't access any free legal services or low-cost services that are available to them. But ultimately, sometimes the appropriate solution for them, because of the reality of factors that are bigger than them and us, it might not be them seeking that justice through the legal system. Another issue is that many of the services that I mentioned, they have limits to their service or they don't have capacity to take on every case. So as I mentioned before, with Legal Aid Ontario, they only offer certificates for some legal matters. Legal clinics and Legal Aid Ontario will only help people who are financially eligible and only for certain areas of law. With Pro Bono Ontario and the Law Society Referral Service, they'll only let someone call a certain number of times about the same issue, and then they won't continue entertaining their calls. And so when I used to work with clients, I would also just be frank with them about that, that there are these limits. And I think it all kind of ties back to what Nat and Helen said earlier about civic engagement and perhaps seeking justice or seeking resolutions um, at a more systemic level. And so sometimes what I would do for some clients, depending on what their issue was, is I would refer them to community and grassroots organizations. So, and I would make that referral. Well, when I would make that referral, I would tell them, like, these organizations might not be able and probably won't be able to help you with your your the problem that you've come to me for, but they could be a way for you to exercise your agency and your power and have your voice heard to change things at a systemic level. Because the great thing about these organizations are that they um, are communities of people from different backgrounds who leverage the power they have to change systems that are often designed not to benefit them, but to benefit those with financial power, particularly corporations. And these organizations can engage in creative strategies and approaches that usually don't engage with the formal legal system. Like the legal system has a lot of limits. It's costly, as Helen's mentioned. It takes time. The solutions you get can be quite limited. You may end up actually spending more money filing applications and paying for a lawyer than however much of a financial award you might get in the end. It might not even just be worth it to file anything. But working with these groups can be a way for someone to kind of attack the larger systemic issues that create these individualized problems. And an example of this that we're seeing across the province, especially of late because of the housing crisis, is all the tenant organizing that's been happening. So you have groups of tenants living in the same building or living in different buildings that are coming together to fight against corporate landlords. And they're doing that outside of the legal system, and they're doing that often without the help of legal professionals, and they're leveraging their power as tenants to fight back against these applications that landlords are making to increase their rent. So that's my spiel. I hope it was useful, and I will turn it to Nat and Helen in case they like to add on to anything I've said or share different thoughts.
No, I mean, I think that where you left things. So first of all, that was fabulous information, and the chat has been very appreciative. I think particularly of the stuff that you've been contributing, Iqra. I think that where you've left it is that there are limitations to the legal system. There are limitations. I mean, it's been sort of a consistent theme through something that everybody has said. So in my context, I have some limitation with respect to the fact that I'm supposed to focus on the charter, where more people, we get more interest in these sort of very practical things that you've talked about. You've talked about the limitations associated with cost. I'm quite sure this is still the case. Don't quote me on it, but I know that up until a number of years ago, if you were somebody in Ontario who worked full time for minimum wage, you were far too wealthy to qualify for legal aid, for any of the legal aid clinics. So that, just to put that in sort of perspective. I mean, you've talked about the difference between knowing that you have a right and knowing how to access that right, and whether actually accessing that right is something which is likely to be successful. And we ask questions within this sort of milieu about whether if you cannot in fact access a right, whether that right functionally exists or does not functionally exist. And when you were sort of speaking about going to a grassroots organization for support, I think you've articulated what I was trying to articulate at the beginning, which is the difference between getting support for your own concrete legal issue and getting support in terms of making a systemic change, and how both of those things are sort of part of what we talk about when we talk about accessible justice and legal capability. I mean, I thought that was fabulous. There are a couple of questions that have come up in the chat. So Ahmed has asked, feel that the most needed area for Ontarians that your services cover are housing and refugee cases. And is that right? I mean, housing certainly is becoming more and more urgent as housing becomes less and less accessible. Where do you get the most interest, do you think?
Another area, Iqra, if you don't mind me just jumping in, and I'll turn back to you, but another area is income assistance. So people seeking information about the Ontario Disability Support Program, ODSP, Ontario Works, OW, um, or people who've received letters saying that they owe back money for CERB or CRB payments. Iqra, are there other areas you feel of great
No,
interest?
yeah, we do get a lot of inquiries about housing law issues. Immigration has been an increase in the past few months with folks asking questions about various immigration applications, and that's tied to I think all of the changes in the immigration programs, particularly the temporary foreign worker programs and the international student programs.
There was, oh, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, that's fine. I was going to, I mean, the other thing is that part of when people experience frustrations accessing the legal system, that in itself is a sort of a pedagogical moment, right? Like the idea and part of what we're trying to do, like both of our organizations have to walk a fine line between education and advocacy because of the ways in which we're funded and things like that. So both of us are funded by a law foundation, which does not fund advocacy work. So that's another sort of functional limitation of all of this. But one of the things that I think we hope to do is to shed light on the ineffectiveness of the system and the justice system's failure to live up to its promise. And hopefully that's something which becomes a sort of a spark for people to do these small sort of grassroots gatherings, which absolutely is functionally part of engaging with community and active citizenship. And within, I think part of why it's so important for folks to hear about what's available from CLEO is because, within this sort of like there's an academic body of scholarship around legal capability and so forth. And folks who are frontline workers are identified as critical, sort of trusted intermediaries. So people who should have access to up-to-date legal information or information about processes. So you folks are like instrumental in helping to sort of move that needle a little bit.
I want to thank you all. I want to invite participants to add questions to the chat as they come to you. I don't mean to interrupt if Iqra or Helen, you wanted to add to what Nat said. But I did want to ask, you spoke about this a lot, and I think it's very relevant to the goals and sort of understanding of active citizenship within the Journeys to Active Citizenship project. And that's around this idea of knowledge being power and a way to engage in civic engagement in itself, right? And I was wondering, because we do have particular, we have activities that are geared towards different populations based on language and age, like language levels and age. So I was wondering if you could speak to sort of the demographics of people you may be dealing with specifically and/or feedback you might have received from the organizations that you work with or have collaborated with.
I can speak to my own experience. So one of the things, so you will have heard Helen say that unfortunately they can't work directly with clients. So they train they train frontline workers. Whereas because of the model that I'm working with, I do have the capacity to speak directly to clients. And part of our community of practice is that I try not to duplicate. So if CLEO has the best resources, I use CLEO resources, and I bring those to bear in wherever I am in Ontario, and I perhaps take some liberty with that, but I do so thinking that I'm supported in it. So I mean, when we worked with newcomers, that it tends to be adult audiences. I'm very interested in schools as well. I think these are actually quite fascinating small microcosms that are operating within schools of people who, because of the way they sort of form a come from they're a cross section of the the forced and voluntary migratory patterns, Tanya, that you spoke about at the very beginning, and so it sort of depends on where we are and what community. So sometimes we are it's an organization which serves a particular ethnocultural community, but sometimes it's an age-based community. In terms of good practice, one of the things that we've learned is that it's been really, really great to work with public libraries. So in terms of partnership, many public libraries are already working, and I'm sure that there's settlement folks out there who are nodding because they know this already, but who are doing settlement work in terms of language acquisition classes, or just getting to know what because they're really, really well structured, and the library feels like the library feels like a friendly place, I think, to people. For a couple of hours and get grocery shopping done, and they have the opportunity to network and meet with other people, and when and settlement groups working together, or like language, like formal language acquisition classes, have been really excellent. To learn English, and you're meeting with the same group of for me to walk into and to speak about rights and things like that. But so that's been my experience with respect to demographics. In the school program, it's everything goes. It's kindergarten all the way up through law school.
Elsa in the chat says, thanks for the love for public libraries. And I noticed that Helen has put in the chat organizations that provide legal information for youth in Ontario include Justice for Children and Youth, as well as the Ontario Education Network. I saw on your last slide, Iqra and Helen, some resources. Would you mind putting those websites in the chat as well?
Sure, we can definitely do that. And just sort of echoing what Nat was saying, and one of the reasons I put the resources for youth in the chat is because we primarily deal with adults as well. Our language, or pardon me, our legal information on steps to justice and through CLEO Connect is primarily for adults, but we do, it's adults in going through all types of different legal issues that we see as well. I mean, Iqra, I don't know if you notice patterns, but I don't think we necessarily see any one particular group.
Yeah, we get quite a broad mix of folks who read our materials. So yeah, and we write for adults. So I don't have anything else to add, unfortunately.
I just note that you mentioned Justice for Children and Youth, and I see that Nanu from JFCY is here as well. So just everybody go look at Nanu Krishnapillai, because he actually does this stuff around undocumented youth and what their rights are. So then big up for Nanu and JFCY.
We have a question in the chat that is in French from Robinson, who says that they are an agent of, sorry, l'Association des francophones du Nord-Ouest de l'Ontario, which is based in Thunder Bay, and 90% of their beneficiaries are newcomers with lots of problems related to their immigration status. Many times they are referred to services but are not receiving adequate solutions. Are you able to orient them to lawyers in immigration for this type of problem, I guess specifically towards a Francophone audience or like clientele? Helen, I see you wrote www.stepstojustice.ca in French/French.
Yes, yeah, slash FR slash. So Nat and Iqra, I hope you don't mind me jumping in. We do have a French language services manager at CLEO. So the live chat is also available in French as well. And that is from 12 to 1 p.m. Monday to Friday. And then human will also respond to messages that are sent outside of that, but that they would respond by email. And we also have a bilingual education coordinator. And so although we don't provide direct services ourselves, you can definitely contact us and we can connect people to Francophone service providers, so legal services, or to community services that may be relevant if needed.
I've thrown a link in for AGFO as well, which is the Association des Juristes d'Expression Français de l'Ontario, which I think is sort of a they do some work which is similar to some of what CLEO does, but in French.
Great, thank you so much. I have one last comment from Ahmed, and then I will let us break for lunch. But they write, we need to focus on youth kids because they are the future, especially in high-risk crime areas, are more close to organized crime groups, recruiting them to join gangs. Having service legal ones for kids could prevent them from joining gangs if they know their rights. Could you speak to sort of criminalization of particular groups, I mean, quickly, and how knowing one's rights or being empowered through knowledge can help people protect themselves from being criminalized and or know what to do once they have become criminalized, I guess, is what this question is pointing to.
Are you asking me to clarify?
Certainly, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I've been with Niche for 8 years now. I started as a youth and child worker. Through this 8 years, I seen some kids really got very nice education. On the other hand, I see some kids literally join the gang and become dealers for whatever substance. And I seen some kids got killed because they are part of that group. And I seen some kids have a potential risk to get joined that groups. The issue I'm talking about, it's specifically in the area I work with, it's called Panorama Court in Toronto. And it's well known as two major gangs controlled. And the police station, I believe it's station 23. They are just very close to that area, but still every week there's some criminal incidents. It has a panorama, it's called Panorama Community Center also, which is, yes, a lot of activities going there. But the gangs I'm talking about still active, still considered as organized gangs. And through my experience, we got a lot of programs talking about helping with after-school programs, for example, talking about music, sport, but nothing in my whole entire like 5 years as youth and child worker and the other 3 years of youth employment worker got any legal coverage, which is needed. And some of these kids, they think they have less power, less rights, especially if they came from complicated family where they have like separated parents or something like that. And they think the only power they can have by joining this organized group to be heard and to be respected in the community. So yes, I think it's education for legal rights need to be going a little bit a step back for a younger age in like different areas. One of them, it's your organization, for example, or other nonprofit organizations, or our organization, and policing. So Toronto Police, they try to do some programs for youth, and it's engaging, it's nice, but it's not available for everybody. It's limited, and sometimes it's funny because the organized crime group are faster to recruit this young individuals vulnerable to their side than the other, like the right side, the bad side. So they have more tools and money to invest and to recruit that kids. This is my experience. And the question is, do you know any service now could cover that gap? And thank you.
So really quickly, I want to say that a couple of the points that you made there, I think are really interesting. One of them was that you pointed to the fact that kids will get involved with these groups because it's a form of accessing some form of power when they are, systematically disenfranchised according to so many other different kinds of social variables kind of thing, right? So there is something sort of legitimate in that goal. And then the other thing that you pointed to was the frustrations that come from being underfunded, whereas the gang or whatever it is might actually functionally have more resources than that. I think one of the things, I'm not an expert when it comes to sort of gang involvement prevention or anything like that, and there are real experts on this, and so those are the people who should be deferred to here. Oh, that's right. Yeah, Iqra has a hard stop, so Iqra's got to go because she's got another appointment.
She's gone. But thank you, Iqra. that you
what I would say is that healthier communities will be more will produce healthier young people and giving people opportunities to engage in different kinds of political activity is really important. In terms of specific programs, I know that the place that I used to work, which was also mentioned up in the chat by Helen, the Ontario Justice Education Network, they do sort of youth police dialogue work. So they do sessions where they have young people in priority neighborhoods meeting with police and sort of sharing some of their experiences and things like that. But one of the unfortunate realities of the law itself is that it tends to be reactive, not proactive, right? So it tends to react to things in the criminal law, and the sort of penal system is fundamentally a reaction to a social problem, and it's not. In many people's views, it's not the best way to react to that social problem. Something that was more preventive in nature which tends to be the case with education-based programs, is better, cheaper, and more successful.
Thank you, Nat. Helen, do you have a final comment? I'm just mindful of the time, and then we can wrap up.
I just want to thank all of you for joining this session and for your questions and for your participation. And please do reach out if you have any questions about CLEO or Steps to Justice.